problems showing up on the screen, I do have a presentation that I can display as well. But you're going to be talking about the adoption of carbon credit programs among SFI participants in Maine. Is that correct, Mark?
That is correct. Thank you. And I will try to share a window here to pull the slides up. We'll see how that goes. And hopefully you're now seeing a title slide.
We are.
Very good. Thank you. So as an introduction, my role is the Forest Program Director for the Nature Conservancy here in Maine. But this presentation is a result of the Keeping Maine's Forest Collaborative and largely the work of Allison Truesdale, who until recently was the coordinator for Keeping Maine's Forests. And want to acknowledge funding for the project was from SFI and the Horizon Foundation. And Allison had originally prepared this presentation to give at the March meeting, and with the reschedule and her taking a new position with IF&W, I have stepped in to help out a little bit. So first, an introduction to Keeping Maine's Forests. Many of you are familiar with it already, but it's a proactive partnership that is somewhat unique in the diversity of its composition across landowners, the forest product industry, recreation, conservation, environmental, and economic development, both agencies and nonprofits. And everyone involved is dedicated to the idea of, as the title suggests, keeping forest in Maine, because we share and understand that the healthy economy and the healthy. This study came from the base question: the carbon offset market look for landowners.
Mark,
We've got millions of acres of certified land. Okay, I am sorry to hear that. What I'm going to do is kill my video so you just have the slides, and perhaps that will help us out a little bit. Are you hearing me okay now?
Yeah, we hear you fine now.
Okay. So basic question was, why have more landowners not enrolled or participated in the carbon offset market?
And Mark,
and the study,
Mark, your slides are not advancing. I think you're not on the slide.
Which slide are you? Which slide are you seeing now?
We're still just seeing your introduction slide, and it's really not actually the introduction slide. You haven't shown us the present. There you go. That's where you want to be. Perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that hiccup. Are you seeing one that says study goals?
We are. We're seeing the correct slide now.
Okay. Well, you haven't missed much. So we'll dive in from here. Essentially, the study was trying to identify factors that either incentivized or deterred landowners from the offset market, identify any possible changes that might encourage more participation, and then to make those findings and recommendations available to SFI and other parties. As I mentioned before, Allison Truesdale led the project. There were 8 or 9 of us that served as advisors to the project. A handful of these folks have retired from their positions at the time, but are probably a lot of familiar names to you. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to how the California Air Resources Board carbon market works, but we'll move pretty quickly on to the results of the study. Basically, the Air Resources Board is what's called a regulatory market because the emitters in California are regulated in their emissions, and the whole program is designed to reduce emissions in California. Mostly that takes place by putting a cap on the actual emissions, reducing that cap over time, and allowing for the transaction of allowances between the regulated entities, so that one that reduces their emissions a lot can sell allowances to another. Within that structure, there are offsets that basically are coming from outside of the system and can be sold in that marketplace to make up a small percentage of the overall reduction. It's important to realize that the overall program is regulating 85% of California's emissions and has a goal of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030 and by 80% by 2050. So the offsets are a small part of that, but the overall program is a pretty major reduction in emissions. There are three basic forest offset project protocols: reforestation, avoided conversion or avoided deforestation, and improved forest management. And because Maine is already 89% forested, reforestation doesn't have a big role here. Avoided conversion has a pretty high standard to demonstrate that without the project, the land would have been developed. And so that hasn't played a significant role either. And improved forest management is the category for all of the offset projects in Maine. It's demonstration of increased carbon sequestration and storage. There are a bunch of other projects that have nothing to do with forests, but capture greenhouse gases or reduce their emissions. All of these offset projects have to demonstrate that there is an additional accomplishment, that accomplishment is permanent or lasting, it's measurable, and it's verifiable. And there are specific requirements in the protocols to meet those four standards. For improved forest management, additionality, the essential premise is that the carbon sequestered has to be above a business as usual average for the ecoregion and has to be beyond any existing legal commitments that the landowner may already have. So you can't get paid for something you're already legally required to do. The business as usual average is based on the U.S. Forest Service FIA data. And the carbon inventories, as many of you are familiar, are very similar to a traditional timber inventory, but take more pieces of the equation into consideration. So they consider trees above 1 inch DBH rather than just larger stock.
Mark, your slides are not advancing. We're still on just study goals.
That's bizarre. Okay. I don't know why that would be, but we can get out of the slideshow mode and try. Doing this.
Yeah, we might want to try it that way.
Okay. The other key considerations for improved forest management, permanence. In the regulatory market, the carbon stocks have to be maintained for 100 years from the date of credit issuance. So when you start a project, it's a 100-year timeline. If you continue to earn offsets, it's 100 years from the last time you sell offsets. They have to be measurable, which means growth and harvest are modeled and reported annually, and the stocks have to be inventoried every 6 years, and verifiable, which means a third party coming in to verify your own measurements. Credits are available for growth, so it's not just your initial issuance or at the project baseline, but you can continue to earn offsets year after year as you increase your stocking. And the protocol imposes certain forest management practices that have to comply with ARB's guidelines. Notably, for a lot of Maine landowners, even age management is subject to restrictions that are similar to, but more restrictive than, the Maine Forest Practices Act. And a key concept is reversals. This is if your stocking decreases beyond or below the commitment that you've made. And they fall into two categories. The things that are not your action are unintentional reversals from fire or insect damage. And the way that the offset market deals with that is every project has to pay some of their initial credits into a buffer pool. Essentially, it's a self-insurance program. And after you've made your contribution to the buffer pool, unintentional reversals, your only obligation is to report and measure. You don't get penalized financially if those things happen. If you intentionally decrease your carbon stocking or harvest more than the protocol allows, then you do have to pay back credits, and a penalty can be imposed. Those penalties decrease over time. They're high at the beginning and decrease as you approach the 100-year window. So that's the quick overview of the offset market. And then the study looked at which projects have taken place in Maine. At the time of the study, there were 7. There now are 10 that are either done or close to done. Together, they comprise over 350,000 acres across Maine engaged in the market. As you can see from this list, it is primarily nonprofit conservation groups that have entered offset projects in Maine, with the 2 exceptions of the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Bascahegan Company. And those are 2 of the largest projects. The Bascahegan project was one of the ones that followed the original study by Keeping Maine's Forest. So what these entities have in common is an inherent long-term perspective on their ownership and willingness to consider a long-term commitment, along with a conservative approach to forest management, leading to relatively strong timber stocking. You see here in red where those projects are located around the state. And these are some of the first results from the study and the interviewing of SFI forest landowners across Maine. First, among deterrents was the cost over 100 years of a project. Those costs include the project development, the ongoing inventory, modeling, reporting, and verification, the contribution to the buffer pool, and the option of potentially setting aside some offsets in case a management decision in the future wanted to reduce stocking. And then on the benefit side, obviously you have the offsets issued and the chance to sell those. You can pair carbon revenue with timber revenue. You gain credit for carbon that's in harvested forest products, especially lumber that is a long-lived forest product. And you gain credit for non-merchantable parts of trees or parts of stands where you'd be unlikely to harvest. There are a lot of uncertainties as well around future priorities for the landowner or future economic and market conditions. Costs, if the landowner were to decide to increase their harvest, and questions around profits could be used or advantageous depending on the structure of the owner. Second type of deterrent was the land ownership type or culture. Essentially, depending on the nature of the landowner entity, there's varying tolerance for risk. There's varying, and that includes risk of reversals, penalties, varying tolerance for regulatory restrictions, or varying desire for flexibility and control. Differences in institutional values and goals regarding timber harvest, different needs for revenue or timing of revenue, and time horizon for ownership. If the ownership entity doesn't expect to be in place for decades, then there are more questions about how an offset project will or won't affect a future sale or ability to divide a property. The third deterrent was the influence of California's regulations, basically in two categories. One, identified by a number of landowners, was a concern about lack of clarity for how the ARB would treat pre-salvage harvests. So we know that insect infestations are considered an unintentional or reversal, but if you are pre-salvaging, will ARB consider that an intentional reversal, or in which case you'd be penalized, or will they consider it unintentional reversal? The other restrictions that were concerns for landowners were the restrictions on even-age management, including size of clear cuts and requirements for buffer areas, and especially there were limits on the percentage of the project area that can be in younger age classes. Many of Maine's forests are young, and unlike in the Forest Products Act, the ARB treats shelterwood harvest as even age management. So it's subject to the same restrictions in terms of acreage as clear cuts. The last one that was a deterrent to some Maine landowners is conservation easement restrictions. And if you have an existing easement in place or you're considering a future easement, some easements have a compatibility issue with offset projects. The easement may prevent a future offset project if essentially the value has already been sold or transferred in the easement. I'm going to switch now to some of the incentives and see that the primary incentives for all landowners were revenue from stands that may be lightly harvested or uncut, revenue from trees or parts that have no merchantable value, and the ability to balance revenue from timber harvest and unharvested areas. For some landowners, the benefit was a large upfront payout for past conservative management, because they had a property with high timber stocking as a result of their management. Managers of third-party certified lands benefit from the preparation they already have in place. They're accustomed to dealing with project inventory, modeling, and verification. And some landowners' existing management approach aligns well with the ARB protocol. So that's a quick overview. I apologize for the hiccups on the presentation, and tried to move through that quickly in the interest of hearing your questions.
So if you have any questions, can you post them to the chat room and we can pull those up? Nobody has any questions for Mark? Well, Mark, you should get a gold star for the best presentation ever, because nobody had any questions for you.
I'm sure it's not because it was such a great presentation. If anyone wants to open up a question, related to the topic, but maybe not specifically to the presentation, I'd be happy to have that conversation as well. But otherwise, we could wrap up.
All right, well, thanks, Mark, for making this possible. We really appreciate you coming in and talking with us and sharing your thoughts, and appreciate everybody for participating. And remember, if you want to get your SAF credits, to send Cindy Pascal an email. She put up her email address at cpascal@maine.edu. And we'll have some more presentations coming up. I believe there's one on Friday. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.